We'll start watching. It takes a little bit for it to show up.
There we go.
Give it just a minute. We'll give it just about 30 seconds here and then we'll get started. Trying to see if it shows up. There we go. I think it worked. All right. Well, welcome. For those of you that are tuning in, my guest this evening is John Kennedy, who I know as my uncle, who is the one that actually got me very interested in family history and genealogy. Hello, Sarah.
Hello, Sarah.
We are going to start out and kind of talk about why I actually got started because I was very interested in photography and looking at family pictures and seeing who is in the pictures and where to go from there. I've had a lot of family members that have done the research before me, which I'm extremely thankful for. And I'm just starting to dig into it a little bit more now that I have a little bit more time without little kiddos running around. So, but John I may have you help me out with your history and your background. You were able to travel the world.
On the government's money, which is always a good thing. But yeah, I was in the Navy for 20 years. I lived in Hawaii, England, Scotland, Norway, Hawaii, traveled all the way to the Red Sea and all the way around the other way to Italy and places like that on travel. I flew in the Navy, so that got me around pretty easily. And then I did 2 disassociated tours, they call it. So I was I did a tour with the RAF in the UK. And then I did another as a exchange officer, they call it, in Norway, where I went to the Norwegian Defense College, which for myself and my family was a very good thing because my wife's Norwegian. They taught me to speak Norwegian, so I was able to converse in Norwegian with my in-laws, and that turned out to be a good experience. And then I came back and I ended my time in the Navy at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. I was a research analyst. I have at that time was called a P code in Northern European affairs, Russia, submarines and all that kind of stuff, because I was in P3 Orions, which are sub hunters. So anyway, that's where I retired.
Yeah. So it fascinates me that you got to go all the places, and you speak how many languages?
Well, I can do
5.
I can do pretty well in Spanish. With Norwegian, you get Swedish and Danish. I can read Danish very well. I can make myself understood sometimes in Sweden. My wife will correct me all the time on Norwegian even, because I have an American habit of not pronouncing each of the letters very distinctly. But when we chatted earlier, I was telling you they've changed the rules in Norway to where you can get your dual citizenship now. And you have to take language classes and go to courses on the social history of Norway and things like that. So when I went to Norway, I had to do a semester at the University of Oslo, and I did that. And I mean, I was just in hog heaven because I got to take all these courses in history, and my wife just, harasses me all the time because I bore people to death with all these facts that I have about Norway, and, which king died where and who was, the guy that united the country, and Vikings and all this. So it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, but as we were talking earlier, that that played well into your your study of the genealogy, because you say, you know why people, what happened in history and why people were moving and why they, groups of people would migrate.
Migrate. Yeah, that's right. And in Norway specifically, they had large families. It was an agrarian country, and then once industrialization started taking over, the laws in Norway are that the oldest son inherits. I mean, this is back, but only the oldest son. So all the other children had the option of becoming tenant farmers for the older brother. And we've all got older siblings, so we know how much hate and discontent that could cause. And so a lot of them went to big towns, and they went into industry, working in the mills and things like that. And going from having fresh air and sunshine and everything like that to working in a mill 12 hours a day and in a city, so smog, that type of stuff. A lot of them just said, this isn't worth it. And so you had a large migration of Norwegians that came, and they primarily went to the Midwest. Some stopped on the East Coast, but a lot of them headed out to Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota. And so if you go there today, you'll see a lot of Norwegian names. And Sons of Norway is in Minneapolis, Minnesota, which is the fraternal organization for this whole thing. So, yep.
Very good.
Yeah.
So we'll go ahead and get started. Hi, Gina. She's on as well.
Hi, Gina.
All right. So why take the time to do a family tree?
Well, I'll tell you how I got started. They had right after I retired, there was an advertisement in a local paper in Middletown, Rhode Island. Mm-hmm. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was the place, the ward, as they call it, the church in Middletown. And there was a group that met there weekly, and they were looking for new members. So I said, I'll be happy to go down there. And there were, not all of them belonged to LDS, but, there were a couple in there. And it's part of their doctrinal belief that families live forever. And so therefore you can go back and do the research, and it doesn't end at death. So you can go back and figure out your family's history and then put it into the record, and you'll see them in the afterlife type thing. More importantly for me, they were willing to share their expertise. So they showed me how to get into the records. And my older son, just so happens after he got out of the Navy, he went to live in Salt Lake City. He worked for Overstock.com. And I'll have to say, when I start this, that I'm not getting paid by any of these companies I'm going to mention during this thing. But he worked there, and we went out, and I was able to go to the Family History Library, which is just a phenomenal resource right there in the middle of Salt Lake City.
Yeah, I've never seen that.
Oh yeah, it's right down, from the headquarters and everything. They've just got people all over the place, and they'll see you come in and they say, what can I help you with, and how would you like to get started? And they've got it not only for the United States, but they have it for Norway, Sweden, you name a country. And there's somebody in the LDS that's probably been there or done it or whatever. And so anyway, they got me started, and very, very nice about, sharing their expertise. Not everybody is quite as nice to help you on this kind of stuff or to give you encouragement. And my own family is similar to that. They wonder why I spend my time doing this, because, it's just a nice thing. They lock my door down in my office and say, stay in there, do your work. And it's good, but, to them, it's just stacks of old pictures and files, and it doesn't have any relevancy for them. And, if it was just that for me, yeah, it probably wouldn't excite me either. But I like to, build a story and find out motivation, why some people did something, and why was immigration important, and how did they get from the East Coast of the United States or the West Coast of the United States to McPherson, Kansas, or someplace in the middle of the United States. And so that's what it was. And the old pictures, I've got lots of old pictures, and I just got more when my younger sister passed, and then from my mother that she had and things like that. And I've got a lot of stuff from World War II, when my dad was in the Navy and overseas, and aunts and uncles, and they lived here and this, that. So I've got a lot of records now, and it helps me to put that meat on the bones and to give it a nice story. But go to methodology now, and and this it's something. Once you collect all of this data, you have to define for yourself how you're going to identify, select, process, and use it. Otherwise, you're just having stacks and stacks of stuff.
So, question before we get into that. So, if someone is just going to start, they haven't done anything yet, where would be, just to give them a piece of advice to start? I mean, where would be the first place that would be to go? I mean, other than...
The easiest thing to do is to go online.
Okay.
And it'll probably refer you to Ancestry.com or FamilySearch.org, which is the LDS website. FamilySearch.org costs minimal. I mean, unless you start tacking things on. If you go to Ancestry.com, it's going to cost you a monthly fee.
I don't think the Family Search, I don't think I've had to pay anything to do that. So
right, but they've got some agreements, I think, that they're working out with, because Ancestry is just so big. They've got access to a lot of records and documents. But the Family Search, as I said, it's a doctrinal belief. These people are working all the time, and they like to do the census. They have people standing by, and they'll send them pages, and they'll transcribe those pages, and they send them back, and everything goes into a big cave out in Utah where they store this stuff so that it doesn't get destroyed over time. So it's a big process. It really is. And that's where I would start.
So just and type in like their parents' name or grandparents' name that they know.
Right. And, like today, when we had talked earlier, I took your great-great-grandfather's name, and I went to Ancestry and I typed it in, and bang. I mean, just, 15 documents immediately appeared. And someone had already done some genealogy work, and there was a family tree. I mean, it was that easy. Okay. And so if you've got if somebody went to Ancestry.com and typed in John Kennedy, I'd probably pop up, and it's that type of stuff. And so it's pretty easy to get started.
Okay.
But one thing I will say, that if you get started, as I said, I was very fortunate to find the local ward of the LDS there in Middletown, because I got support. And that's something you really need, you're sitting there and you're asking a question. And that's what we used to do in these groups. Somebody would come in with a problem, and they'd say, case in point, I had a friend, and he was probably 10, 15 years older than me. And he was looking for an uncle that was killed in the First World War, and he could not find him. And he says, I know he was killed. Right before the armistice in 1918, but I can't find him. And so just so happens, I knew a guy that worked for the VA cemeteries. And so I wrote him an email, and he contacted the place in France, and France went to their database, and they sent me a picture of the guy's grave. The problem was, the reason he couldn't find it is they put the name in reverse. So instead of being Thomas Murphy, it was Murphy Thomas, and that's the way it was in the database. So it never got there. And so they were able to correct their database, and I was able to get the picture, and the story came together. But those are the kind of problems we worked on. And so that got you into a lot of data that you would not normally run across in a day-to-day type thing. So it was a good background. It really was.
Okay. So it's basically like a networking group when you have the smaller groups that talk with each other, have resources at their fingertips.
Right. And, it's like any other club, it was just, it was good fun, and we did things. So
very good.
Felt good about it.
I got you off the methodology.
Yeah. Well, no, the other thing I was going to mention was the fact about the PBS show and, Finding Your Roots with Henry Gates. And he has it's an hour-long program. He has a celebrity, or usually about 2 or 3 celebrities over this hour period that the show's on. And he'll take and go from that individual back to their parents, back to their grandparents, and then show how they got to the United States and where they lived in Europe or whatever. And, it's a very lineal process. He can find documents like passenger lists. He can find a census. He can show where they lived on a Google map and that type of thing. And they'll have a map of the region of Europe they came from. And but he follows it back, and he only goes back about 3 or 4 generations. It's very limited in time, so he can't do a deep dive, and so it's sort of skimming the surface. Very entertaining show. You can learn some techniques and stuff like that, but you don't see the actual get into the machines. Everything from a card reader to slide projectors to online research to books. But those are the kind of things you get into, and they mention that, and so they always come up with a surprise for each celebrity. I bet you didn't know this about your parents, or what do you think about this about your great grandmother, and why they came here. But it follows a lot of the strife in the world. People immigrated for a reason, and all of you that I see on here right now are all too young to, the World War II and what happened. I mean, you've read about it in history books and things, but it was a lot of turmoil. And, if you were Jewish in Europe or the Soviet Union, which was, back in the 1930s, but everything after the First World War, things really got tight, and, people were pushed and forced to move for survival's sake. And, so you had a lot of people that got moved out of Russia or Eastern Europe and ended up in, Poland or Germany or something like that. And then World War II comes, and some of them were lucky enough to get out. A lot of them weren't. So that's an interesting trail to find too. If you go through the records of, Dachau or Birkenwald or, any of these places. So anyway, if you want to do a deep dive, the first and most important thing that you want to do is talk to your parents and talk to your older relatives that are still alive. I didn't do that enough. I went through albums with my mother and father, and they pointed to people and told me who they were, and I understand that. But how my family got out to Missouri, it was always sort of an interesting little mystery. And how did they all came together in, the center of Missouri. And why did my mother's father, my grandfather, why did he move the family from Sedalia to Kansas City? And that was something that always puzzled me. And I think I just broke the code on that one, because he worked for the railroad, I found. He worked for a company. He was a blacksmith, and he worked in their foundry for the railroad company. And then in the early 1900 or 1920s, they had a strike, and I mean it was a big strike. International Workers of the World, the IWW, they were called the Wobblies, and they were a socialist communist group in America. And so the Pinkertons were called out, and they had all sorts of strike breakers, and they fired these people all en masse. So all of a sudden, a lot of railroad workers didn't have jobs, and they had to go someplace else to find jobs. And if you live in a small town, which Sedalia was at that time, you probably go to Kansas City, and that's what they did. And he became a carpenter and worked for a silo manufacturing company. And so those are the kind of things, but that adds, perspective and, helps tell a story. And, and that's the fun part for me.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's what you say that you like is some people like just the dates and the names and everything, but you like to actually put the pieces together like a puzzle.
Yeah. And as I say, it's much more fun to, if I could start talking about the 1920-21 rail strike in America, there's a lot of things written on that. So it's a pretty interesting thing. The second thing that you need to know when you start your research is you have permission to use other people's work. As I said, I can go on Ancestry or Family Search, type in somebody's name, and probably somebody has done a family pedigree. And you can tap into that, and you get a lot of good information. Some of it's not necessarily correct, but at the same time, it gives you a good starting point. And I find that just to be, a great help. And you get some good ideas. And you may go down a couple of blind alleys, but at the same time, you understand why they're blind alleys. Something doesn't match with something else you found. And so a red flag goes up. And then you have to research that and find out, well, why isn't that right? And then you start unraveling the knot, and you get it. Next thing you need to do is you need to look at census data. You need to look at vital records, church records. Churches, a lot of people didn't write early on, or they had minimal writing skills. You didn't have all the government agencies we have today. And so the church was responsible for, being the center of a lot of people's lives, because you were baptized and they buried you and you went to church and all this kind of stuff. You had, the minister over for Sunday dinner, things like that. And so you were very involved in the church itself.
Well, and they kept track of the dates of the baptisms, of the births, the deaths,
Well, that's it. And when you have records like that, some of them were done accurately. But if you didn't have a church, or you lived on a farm out in the boonies, or you lived on the frontier of the United States as the country was developing, you may not have been near a county seat or a church or something like that. And so you had to wait until you had a reason to go there. And then you would say, oh, by the way, I had a child that was born, 3 months ago. Wow, what day? I don't know, the 15th. And then all of a sudden that became so-and-so's birthday. You can, after a fact, compare that data with census data, because then they would know a little bit more about it. And death records are another thing that I'll discuss those here.
Do you want me to put up the census?
There's one more point I want to make, is that when you do these records that I just discussed, that leads you into another level that you can search for information. And that's land records, probate records, tax records, military records, immigration and naturalization.
So if someone's looking for those records, where do they go?
There's a variety of places. You have, as I say, Ancestry, Family Search. Another good place to go is National Archives.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And you can go to there's several. I'll get to. At the end. I've got some websites and things like that people can actually go to and try some of this, and it works out well.
Gina just said, Jack said hi, Uncle John.
Who there? Yeah. You got to get organized. That's another thing. Once you start collecting all this stuff, what are you going to do with it? And for many, many years, I've been throwing it into 3-ring binders, and I've got stacks and stacks. I've got, folders, and then subfolders that I take with me if I'm going to go do some research. And I finally made the decision I'm going to organize myself. And what I found is a woman named Mary Hill. She was a instructor at BYU, and she worked at the Family History Library in Salt Lake City. And she developed a family roots organizer color-coded system. And you can go on to Family Roots and look that up, and it is very detailed. They give you, well, before you start, you're going to have to buy the following items, and then 2 bins that hang, hanging files to go in there. And then it tells you step by step what you need to do. And it takes you back. The one that she did was 5 generations. And so you can do that. And then you start building the families of those 16 ancestors. Okay. And so that's my next project. So that's going to keep me busy for a while. Another thing is, one of my problems with my organization is that my tastes are very eclectic, and I find something out. Like, I was researching this family called the Holmes family, and I came across an entry where there were some letters written from the mother, Isabella. Isabella Holmes, and then the daughter was Elizabeth Holmes Weir. And they were writing to a brother or son that had migrated to the United States, and his name was Nathaniel. Now, the letters were written 1791 to 1805. They came from Strabane in County Tyrone in what is now Northern Ireland. And they talk, you talk about putting meat on something. It's a letter was, I'm writing to inform you, unfortunately, your brother has died. And then another one's, your uncle's died. And then, we had, we're worried right now about the French invading Ireland, because of the Napoleonic Wars. And then the sister starts writing that she would like to migrate, to the United States, or immigrate, I should say. And so all of this, it's very personal stuff. And I'm surprised because, it's pretty easy to read. You have to understand a little bit about the way they wrote older English, some of the letters they formed and things like that. But I did not think a lot of people would have had the educational level to write these kind of letters. And so maybe they had someone write them. I have not done a detailed handwriting analysis of all these letters to see if they were written by the same person. But in some towns that I know, they had, educated people in town that you would go to and dictate a letter to, and they would write it down and then say who it was from, sign it, things like that. But it was beautiful handwriting, and it's, I should be so fortunate to have such good handwriting. It was very good stuff. But another detour I've taken lately is my wife's family. She had a second cousin that did a history of the development of my wife's grandfather's farm, and how they moved from one part of Norway to this new part, and talks about, the number of kids and how they They had a hotel. They had it was on the wagon route, going north. It was the primary route until the train came, but they had, buses and things like that. But when the train came in, it changed everything. But the second cousin of my wife's that wrote this, slanted it more towards his family, and it told the full story of his family, but it sort of, oh yeah, this, Ivar was born and he went to school in Sweden, and then when he came back, he had they had a restaurant, a filling station, and he was a mechanic. He was a mechanical engineer. That's what his training was in. And so anyway, I said, I'll take it, and I'll start with the second cousin's article, and then branch off and then do my wife's family. And then, as I say, I'll always use other people's research. So he had done a lot, and he had good pictures and things like that. But on my wife's side, she had a family that did a Schlechtbuch, and that's a family history also. And it talks about my wife's mother's side of the family. And so now I'm going to marry those two together and try and develop, something, a full story, because especially during the Second World War, the Germans occupied Norway. So there's a lot to tell as far as the, Germans came into town, took over his business. He worked for the Germans, as a mechanic, and, because they had to eat, but then they didn't get a lot of food. So they ate a lot of turnips. My wife won't eat turnips today. It's one of those things, because even after the war, it was, they just minimal stuff, and you ate a very basic diet. You had your own garden, and you grew stuff because it was necessary. So there's a lot of interesting things like that, and so that's what I've been doing. So
anyway. In the gaps, like you said.
But the next thing is the vital records that you want to look at.
Yeah, and I had a question about that too. So
okay, you want to ask first?
It's up to you. You can fit it in whenever it works. But she said her family has Native American ancestors. But how do you find information that route? Any tips? So wherever that fits in, you can kind of, whether when you're doing the vital records or.
Yeah, and it some of that depends on what tribe they belong to, where they were at the time.
She knows. Lisa, if you're still on there, tell me what tribe it was if you're still on. But and so
there's some things you can do through ancestry.com.
Okay.
Family search, I highly recommend. But the first place I would start on that would probably be the National Archives.
Okay.
And that's because it is a very broad-based stuff. I mean, historians go there to do their research.
Okay.
Genealogists do too, but it's one of those that they kept records of migration patterns. Okay, and there's been a lot of books written about that, as far as what's a good example? A good example
is the Missouri Blackfoot.
Okay. And were they always there, or did they migrate there from someplace else? Does she know? Yeah. Yeah. See, that whenever you ask a question, I find that you can probably think of about 4 more questions to support it. Yeah, there's a lot of things that, the Trail of Tears, when they came out and they were being relocated to Oklahoma. And this is going to sound strange, but if you read a biography of George Armstrong Custer, he did a lot of stuff out on the frontier in Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and then up through the Little Bighorn up in Montana. So and especially if you look at the history of Kansas, you got a lot of the forts that they were building as they came along. And so Indian tribes and settlers would gravitate towards those forts. And so you see a lot of history right there that you can go to. So Fort Riley, for instance, or Fort Larned, those were all big, Dodge City even, you start looking at the local town history at that level, and you might be surprised to find something. But first and foremost, I'd go to the National Archives.
Okay.
I don't know where Lisa lives, but if she lives in Kansas City,
she does.
There's a National Archives right downtown Kansas City, and it's there used to be on Pershing and Broadway, but
figure it out.
I think there's another one out in Independence now, but I've never gone to them yet. I was sort of an East Coast guy, so I didn't go to a lot of those. But anyway, I was going to talk about vital records.
Yes.
And vital records are death records, marriage records, birth records. And one of the first places to start is, believe it or not, the death record. Now, if you want to put one of those up,
yes,
death records are just a plethora of information. You'll get the full names of the individual. So this is my great-grandfather, and this is Samuel James Kennedy. You get the date and place of his death. He lived in, I want to say, Monotone County, and I think he died in Stover or something like that. Cause of death tells you how he died, tells you what his occupation was. He was a farmer forever, for 60 years down in that area. Talks about his parents' name and where he was born and where they were born, and then where was he buried. So you can actually go down and see probably the funeral home and where they actually interred the body. So it's just a great source of data. And it's the last thing that happened to that individual. So it gives you not only an endpoint, but it gives you a starting point to look at all this other information that's on here.
Okay.
I gave you another one also, I think.
You did.
Now, this is my other grandfather. This is my mother's father, and his name was Platt W. Gulick. He was the one that worked for the railroad and then went to Kansas City. So it says on here that he was a carpenter, I think. I don't have it with me, right?
Yes, it does.
Andy? Yeah.
Yeah, I can.
But, and I'll bring it up again later, but you'll notice that he died at the age of 43 of pneumonia and lumbar pneumonia, no less. And he worked for the Butler Manufacturing Company, who makes silos and that type of thing. And he died in 1934. That's important because I'm going to show another document later that helps me bring out a point that don't always believe what's written down someplace. So he died very young. My other grandfather, my father's father, he died also in, I think it was 1932 or 34. The same thing, but he died of tuberculosis in Texas. And then they brought the body back up and he's buried in Versailles in Missouri now. But it tells you on this document exactly what happened. Now this goes into his father was French Gulick. His mother was Anna Wynne. So you know her maiden name, which helps you start going back that.
Right.
And the informant was Mrs. Ora Gulick. Now that was my grandmother. And it's also important on these to look at who the informant was. My grandmother would know her husband quite well and would know who his parents were, had interacted with them. But if your informant was, let's say you lived out in a town and, everybody else had moved away or something and you died and your next door neighbor is the one that's the informant, he's not really going to know that much about your family history.
Okay.
So you've got to understand who's doing the telling. And that's very important. I mean, then maybe they have an agenda, and there's there's things like that you have to be very cognizant of.
Okay.
So, but the next thing is a marriage license, and I know you have one of those too.
I do.
This I put in here because of two things. Number one, I was looking for a family member who married into a family called the Moon family, MOON, and I found it, the record. But whenever I look for one, I always look for two, because sometimes sisters get married or brothers get married at the same time, and so it'd be recorded, close at hand. But in this one, it's from 1895, and it tells you, what the age of the people were when they were married, gives you their names. If one of them was underage, the parent or somebody had to sign for them to get married and to say that, I give my permission for so-and-so to get married. Mm-hmm. And then it was attested. You had the recorder, and then you had the minister who did the service, and they all signed it. And when these started out, like if I went to my great-great-great-grandfather, you find out that it was just handwritten into a ledger, and it was recorded at the courthouse. And I'll get to it a little bit later, but that was the extent of it. So-and-so married so-and-so on this date, and then they went to the next person. By this time in 1895, these things are very pro forma. You had a template, you filled in the blanks, and then you knew. But this one here, and it's, I can't point to it, but it's in the middle page, on the right page there. Yeah. It talks about the minister, and it's supposed to say licensed minister, but it says a licentious minister. So your word for the day is licentious, and you can actually look it up. And so this guy either had a bone to pick with the minister, or he just had a warped sense of humor, and he thought that would be funny to put in there. But every once in a while, you see these little things like that just sort of give you a little chuckle, and it really personalizes the record, because you see that people had a sense of humor in 1895, because it's actually it's pretty hysterical, I think. But anyway.
But so all the documents are helping you match the dates and the places and the people. It just kind of makes sure the pieces fit together.
Well, that's it. And it really makes them come alive. That's the thing. And it's just not a name or a picture that's in a frame and you don't even know who it is. It gives you a place in your heart, or your soul, or something, that something about these people. So it's pretty good. Birth records we talked about a little bit, and and as I said, that back on the East Coast, we found it a lot that some of the farms, they were out and they just couldn't get back to record a birth, and so they just waited. And so sometimes it wasn't quite accurate. I mean, you weren't 5 years difference or something like that from your actual age or anything, but it could be an approximation. So what do you do when that happens? In this case, I would say go to cemetery records. Cemetery records, you can go right to the headstone, and it'll usually give you the date that person was born and died. Sometimes it'll tell you it's, Anna was married to Samuel, and, here's their name. And it might even give you the maiden name. Sometimes that happens. And then you have church records, as we spoke of before. You have obituaries. Obituaries are a great source of information, because that'll tell you, who the children are that are still alive. He survived by X amount of children, or predeceased by, 2 children, and it lists their names. And so all of a sudden it expands your view of who the individual was, what they did, what their profession was. Were they married twice? That ends up giving you some interesting little things also. military records. I did some research in military records. There was a class action lawsuit, and there was my father ended up dying. He was 48 years old, and he died of pancreatic cancer. And we always just thought, he was a heavy smoker. He smoked, 2 packs of cigarettes a day. And we just sort of wrote it off as that. Well, one day I was reading an article in a magazine, military magazine, I might add, and they were talking about this class action lawsuit about people who had been exposed to atomic energy. And my father was at Eniwetok, which was one of the atomic sites that they practiced at, when they were detonating these things out in the Pacific. And they actually, I remember my father telling me they had him go up on deck and, gave him sunglasses and say, hey, we're going to have this big blast out here. Why don't all you guys face that way? And they did. And now, these guys are dropping like flies, most of them are dead now, but because they were exposed to radiation. And so anyway, they did this lawsuit. Well, you had to prove all sorts of stuff. By that time, my mother had passed. Sandy, my older sister, had passed. So what they did was they went to the surviving relatives. So you had to know who they were. And then you had to present the fact, all the records showing that, my mother was dead, my sister was dead, so you had to have death certificates for them. And then you had to show that my father was actually there. Well, I had gone to the National Archives, and you can request military records. So you can go to, as long as you're the surviving relative of that individual, you can request a copy of these records. And so I had my father's complete, military record, and it's probably 1.5 inches thick.
Oh, wow.
Because he was in during the Second World War and then during Korea before he got out. And it was in the reserves in between. But I was able to prove this, and then all of a sudden, a check shows up in the mail. And so, and they did all the work, dividing the money out and everything like that. So, but that's why you need to have records. And by the fact that I had the majority of these records, it made it very easy to do. But it's, if I had started from scratch when I read this article, I probably would have missed the deadline or something like that. So it was good to have that data. And one other one that you can get to, and more recently, you have the Social Security Death Index, and you can get that online pretty easily. So, what you have here, this is a 1940 census. Before you put this one up, put up the 1790 one.
Let's see if I have that one. I don't know if I have that one.
Okay, don't worry about it. Go ahead and put that back up. That's
okay. Sorry.
The census in the United States started in 1790. And if you look at a 1790 census, it is, where you're at, who's the head of the household, and it writes the man's name. And then it says, how many boys above the age of 16 are in the, live here? How many below the age of 16? How many women? How many slaves? And then how many others? And it doesn't, tell you what that others is. It could be a wide variety of things. So that's it. It's very minimal, and you had to be a property owner to be counted, because you were worthless unless, you had property and, this, that, and the other thing. And heaven forbid if you were a woman, because your name didn't even get recorded. And that was the way it was. So if you go to the 1810 census, it's pretty much the same. But as you go farther up, and this one here is 1940, and it tells you just a wealth of information. Out of all these censuses, from 1790 until 1940. The only one you can't access is the 1890 census. It was destroyed in a fire in 1921. Now, you may still need to go to find something out that happened in 1890. You can actually go, some states did their own census in that time frame. And so we had instances back in when I was in Rhode Island that, New York did its own census, and people could go to New York and say, hey, I want, such census data. And they would send it to them. Very helpful people. But other times you have to sort of have a workaround. Now, the 1940, that's the last census that's been published right now. And there's a law that says you can't release data for 72 years after the census was taken. So the next one we're going to have comes out in 2022, and that's going to be the 1950 census. So 1940, it's a little bit before my time, but when I look at things, I know who the people were. And, that really starts helping you because you know who lived where. And the 1940 is just a phenomenal stuff. And I've actually, you can't see it on there.
Yeah.
But all that writing at the top is my handwriting because I make it bigger because I wear glasses and I need to see things better. But it tells you, I know that my grandmother lived with her family at 1012 Bennington in Kansas City. So I know the exact place they lived. And I know who was there at the time. Has my grandfather. Now, think back, I covered him a little bit earlier, that he died in 1934. But it says here that he's the head of the household. I don't know why they would have him in there. If you go all the way to the far right where it says what is his job, that's blank, which probably makes sense if he's dead, but he should not have been counted as far as what the census was. But then my mother's on there, and they call her Marjorie, and that wasn't her name. Her name was Margie. And so you go through these things, and you have to look at them, but take them with a grain of salt every now and then. Don't think it's the gospel. So you want to keep working on these things. But it, really helps. It tells you, where everybody was born, what's their age at this time, what's their sex. My mother was employed at Sears in 1940, and so I have all these things. And then some of this stuff that I recently added to my collection was actually my mom's ID card at Sears, and what she did. And so, I mean, it's really interesting, but it puts it together. It really helps you when you're doing these things. So anyway, we know what the next census is going to be.
And I had no idea till you said that it was held for that long. I didn't know that.
Yeah, and it's it's sort of like the Privacy Act. They don't want. They don't put a lot of personal data, so you won't see Social Security numbers and things like that. Mm-hmm. But when you're trying to trace your family, like I knew my grandmother ran a boarding house. And one of the boarders, I come to find out, was a guy who became my Uncle Lloyd, so, they were there, and he lived at the house and met the daughter, and, as they say, things happen, and they got married, had a long, happy life together. So it was very nice. But anyway, if you want to do census data, as I say, you can go online, but if you're just starting out and you don't want to pay the money, and if you can't find what you're looking for at familysearch.org, which you probably could, but go downtown to the National Archives.
Okay.
It is just a great source, and it's got history on just everything in the world. I mean, I used to do a lot of research on naval matters, what ships were built where, really interesting stuff, but during World War II, that was big stuff. You had to build a lot of ships and things like that. So we trained in Newport. That was a naval training station at that time for recruits. And so they brought crews together, trained them, and then sent them en masse to a ship that was being built. And as soon as it was done building, they put a crew on it, and then they were off, heading out to the Pacific or someplace like that. So it was quite a, I don't know what you'd say, a chain reaction type thing. This happened, so this had to happen, and they just put them out, and they were doing, hundreds of ships, but it required men, and you had to put these men through quickly and get them trained. Yeah. Okay. Passenger lists. Yeah. Now, when you're out in the middle of Kansas or Missouri, you don't think too much about relatives that they had to get there somehow. And the ones that came from Europe, or even if they came from Asia, they documented these things. Now, one of the big places that I went to, because it's a place called Ellis Island, and it's right there in New York City. Mm-hmm. And it also has a Statue of Liberty on it. So it's a twofer when you get to go out there. You get to do two things and have a lot of fun. But they have some great exhibits. They have things like, the luggage that these people brought with them. And you don't think too much about that, but, you didn't get to bring a lot with you when you came. And so if you had in Norwegian, they call them kistas, and it's a painted, handmade chest. And it was sort of like a woman would have a trousseau, or, that type of stuff,
So like a steamer trunk type.
Yeah. And, she'd put, if had sheets, or, her best bunad was their country costume, and then things she needed to get married, and these were all kept here. But that was the only thing they would get to bring. They didn't get to bring 16 suitcases and clothes for every occasion, and then they had to come over, and then you had to make do and expand. And they have all these things on display there, and it's just you can be lost for hours just imagining what the stories were and how these people got there. But Ellis Island, it existed, and there's actually an Irish song about this, from 1892 until 1943. And during that time frame, 17 million people came through Ellis Island. And before that, you had Castle Garden, and that was the immigrant processing center right downtown New York City also. And that was from 1855 to 1890 timeframe. And you can get a lot of this at the Library of Congress. You can get these passenger lists. So that helps you out quite a bit. And you can also get it on, Ancestry and Family Search and that. But the Library of Congress is very good at this type of thing. Okay. And that sort of flows right into immigration. Mm-hmm. And when these people came, think about what it is right now. The political environment in the United States and immigrants. It's not exactly a topic that you bring up with people you don't know, because your views may excite somebody, one way or the other. And that's the way it's always been in the United States. At one time, the states controlled immigration. Now, if you can imagine that, we didn't have 52 states at that time, or 50 states, sorry about that, and territories, I should say. But there were so many sets of rules that the federal government actually took over immigration, and they would control it. So New York got out of the picture, but they had controlled a lot of it, because they had so many people coming through. Virginia was another place. Boston was another place. So you had all these things, but immigrants, it was a porous boundary type thing. So they could come in from Canada. So ship taken into Nova Scotia, and they could come inland and then go south and cross into the United States. So there may not be a record necessarily, but maybe that state did keep a record. And once the federal government took it over, they couldn't decide where they wanted it. So it was in the Department of Labor for a while. It was in the Department of Justice. And now it's in the Department of Homeland Security. And so all of these things have changed over time, and the rules change over time. And it depends on what the ethnic group is. That's another big thing. Do we limit Japanese or Chinese or Africans, or we don't want any more Irish coming up, that type of stuff. So you had some really arbitrary rules that happened throughout history. And the other thing is they wanted to try and confuse you, so they kept changing the name of what this was, and it was the Immigration and Naturalization. That's what I remember early on, INS. Then it became the Bureau of Citizenship and Immigration Service, and so that was BCIS, as it was called, and now it's USIS, which is the U.S. Citizen and Immigration Services. So these things just keep changing all the time. However, our government, if you want to spend the money, USIS does have a good program for delving into these records. And they have tutorials and things like that. And you can actually go on. You got to pay money, but you learn a lot by doing that kind of thing. But as I said, Ancestry, Family Search are just as good as what they do. The thing you need to check on, though, if you think back to everything from the fact that other countries don't necessarily have 26 letters in their alphabet. In Norway, you have 29, and they use them in their names too. And so you're coming through the gate, immigrating into the United States, and lo and behold, the guy writes down what he hears, and he writes your name differently than what it actually was, and you have a new name. Another thing is they just may have written it down wrong. I mean, literally. And the other one is some immigrants took the opportunity to change their identity, because maybe they were a wanted man in, Germany or in Ireland or Italy. If you want to, the first edition of The Godfather, when he migrates over here, he takes the name of the town that he came from. But that's because you wanted to disappear. And so all of a sudden you had a new identity, and you could start anew. So you got to be careful, and you sort of have to follow these threads back and keep a hold of them as you do it. After someone dies, you can really go to cemeteries and find out some information. Now, you had the one thing on your great-great-grandfather there.
He's one of the greats.
Yeah, one of the greats back there. And this one, Patty and I were discussing earlier, she was telling me that she had an uncle, I think it was, right? Great uncle?
Great uncle.
And he did research on that side of the family. Mm-hmm. And he came up with the name and, how they got out here. And so I just, for the fun of it, went online and did a quick search. Mm-hmm. And when I put his name in, I had there he is. I had about 15 documents come up associated with this guy's name. And looking at it, some of the documents, I always try and keep a timeline in my head. And if they say they married somebody, you've got to make sure they were, number one, old enough to get married, number two, to have children, and that sort of thing. So you start keeping an idea in your mind what you expect to see.
Okay.
And so anyway, Patty had said, he was born in 1811. And so I went back and I looked at it, and I found the headstone. Yeah. And it's in Sweden. Now, this guy had immigrated to the United States in 1852. Now, all of a sudden, it says here that, let me translate from the Swedish. It says, here lies Olaus Bingston. He was born 1 December 1811, and he died 4 January 1874. Mm-hmm. And then it says down at the bottom, he lived in Illinois in North America from the years 1852 until 1873, which means that he had to go back to Sweden. And so there is that. And so this record that Patty had, I mean, the uncle did a good job, but this would be a red flag for me because he says he's buried in Illinois.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, I'm reading it incorrectly, which is a possibility. But.
Could be in Swedish. The other thing is Patty told me he sailed from Gothenburg or Göteborg, as they would say, mm-hmm. and went into Boston. Mm-hmm. I found by just
Boston Harbor.
Going on to look at passenger lists, I found the ship. It was called the Mimosa out of Göteborg, and it came from Göteborg to Canada, to Nova Scotia. And so then from Nova Scotia, it went down to Boston. So in actuality, I mean, the original place, but there was a stopover. And they arrived there on the 23rd of June, 1852.
Mm-hmm. That's what I had.
Yeah. And so now I've got the list of the passenger list here, and it says, Olaus gives me the wife and the 4 children's name and their ages, and whether they're male or female, just so found 2 documents right away on that. So that's good. But I had the cemetery record that definitely pinpointed what his name was, mm-hmm. when he was born, when he died, and then on top of that, I had the fact that he lived in the United States until 1873. So all those things add up to start telling the whole story about what happened. So when they lived, when they died, so that sort of bookends it. But at the same time, if you can't find a death certificate that would give you that sort of information, you can go to obituaries in the newspaper, and you'll see that gives you a lot of information also, like where you lived, what town you were in, who you're survived by, which children were alive when you died, and some that were, predeceased you. And so it just goes on and on. So there's a lot of things that you can see on obituaries. One of the most ubiquitous, if you will, sites that you can go to is Find a Grave. If you think where a relative's at, you can actually post it. And it's a very well maintained and updated website. And somebody will probably go out there and take a picture of it for you if that's what you want, so that you can get some information. I was doing some research one time down in Versailles, and there was a guy there that he had done a database of all the people that had died in Morgan County and where else, what is that, Cooper, all these counties right around there. So I've got stuff from Stover, from Fortuna, just relatives that I had. And, some of them I knew, some of them I didn't know, but they had the right name. So now I've got to figure out where they fit in the puzzle on the whole thing. So it's pretty good. And if you look up the ancestor and you get a photo, I mean, you're just a step ahead, and it's really nice. We talked earlier about internet. Mm-hmm. Now, this is almost a reading exercise for me because there are hundreds of places you can go on the internet.
You can give me the top ones, and I'll put them in here so people have them actually that they can go to.
Okay. Well, I can send you this after the fact if you want.
Then I can add it.
But there's you got ancestry.com. As I say, tons of data. Mm-hmm. Familysearch.org. If you go to the National Archives, that's archives.com. And as I say, it's just a great place. I could spend days there and forget what I went there for. So it's one of those things.
Lots of rabbit holes.
Yeah, and Roots Web, that's another one. You'll see newspaper.com. There's an interesting thing to get. That it's been subsumed by ancestry.com,
Okay.
and but you can go on there, and so I can go to the Sedalia paper, and I can find a great uncle's obituary, and that tells me just tons of information. Or I can find uh, articles where my great uncle's uh, son-in-law had just come back as a sergeant in World War II, things like that. And so you really get a lot of, hometown type information, sort of like, reading the McPherson Sentinel. But genealogybank.com. Now, there's one that a lot of people don't see, but that has historic newspapers, and it also has a Social Security death index.
Okay.
So that's a really nice one to look at. Military records, as I said, NARA, National Archives. That's a good place, but then there's one called Fold 3, and that's a paid service type thing.
Okay.
You can get a lot of the enlistment or the registration for the draft or when they got pulled in and things like that. So I've been able to find those for my grandfather, so on and so forth, World War I time frame, and it puts it in there nicely. For those of you in Missouri, now this one I have to read because I don't do too much in Missouri, but it's digital.shsmo.org. And that gives you Missouri history, it gives you genealogy, it gives you a family history section, and they'll walk you through it. But a lot of these records, you can sit there and, I can call up relatives, marriage licenses. A lot of my cousins might get upset with that, but I could, when they got married and this, that, the other. But, my uncles, I've got the majority of their marriage license and who they were married to and when and all that type. So it's a lot of information that you can get just on normal Missouri websites, if you will. The other one for death certificates in Missouri is s1.sos.mo.gov. Boom. And that gives you death certificates.
Okay.
And that's where I've gotten the majority of these certificates that I put up here today, is just, you can put in there, and if you know what county they lived in, and or if you know the county and you're not sure, which is another thing. Whenever I travel and I do research, I take maps with me. And there's a site called mapgeeks.org. Sounds strange, but they do maps of everything. So you can get an 1850 map of Missouri, and you'll find out that the county lines aren't the same as what they are today. Okay. So this town in 1850 may have been in this county over here, and in 1890 it's in this county over here. So you got to be careful when you start saying, well, I'm going to go to such and such a courthouse. And they say, wow, we don't have that record here. And you say, I wonder why. And then all of a sudden the light goes on that it may be different than what you suspected. If you want to find, I did the story about the fellow who had an uncle that was killed in the First World War. That is CEM cemeteries, cem.va.gov. And that has over 3 million Americans that are buried someplace else in a VA grave somewhere. Okay. And, you see anytime it's, around D-Day and things like that, they always show the cemeteries there in France. This has them all listed on who is actually there. Oh, wow. And then there's, they didn't transport people. I mean, you sort of got buried where you died. So in Italy, in Tuscany, when you came up from Salerno and you're going towards Rome, it was tough fighting all the way. And there's several little pocket cemeteries as you go through. And so this helps you to locate a relative if you actually want to, get a rubbing or a picture of the headstone.
Tell me
So
that.
it really comes in handy.
It was cem.va.gov.
va.gov, yeah.
Okay.
The last thing, or close to the last thing, how long this is going. DNA testing.
Yeah.
That's the big buzzword, and I talked about it a little bit earlier. They always talk about it on the PBS series, and you see Ancestry advertises it, 23andMe advertises it. But I did my first one probably about 15 years ago, and it was the Sorensen Genealogical Foundation or something like that. It was out in Salt Lake City. And they have since been subsumed by Ancestry.com also. And so Ancestry's got a lot of tentacles out there. But anyway, it was very, very superficial. And it just gave a, you came from this area of Europe and you have X amount of this Northern European, and then you have some Central European. And I knew, from my own research, there's a lot of Dutch, there's some English, there's an Irishman thrown in there, or two actually, thrown in there. And so it was very broad brush, like 4-inch paintbrush. And it, you didn't get the detail you wanted. Another thing that I did another one, but it was specific I was looking for an actual gene marker. And so health-wise, you look for these things. And it was called the APOE4 gene. And that's associated with Alzheimer's, which my family has a history of, unfortunately. And so you have predominantly, there's the APOE2, then the 3, and the 4. If you have the 4, you get one gene from each parent, and if both of them are 4s, unfortunately, you're getting a nod that you have a higher probability of Alzheimer's.
Just yeah.
Huh?
I said the risk is higher.
Yeah, the risk.
Yeah.
The other ones, if I had, or say 2 APOE2s or 3s and things like that, if I was a female, you have a lower risk of heart disease if you have those. So, it's nice to know, if you've had heart disease in your family, that can be one of the things that is a trigger for it. And it's good to know genealogically, if you're trying to get your family history sorted out, for one way or the other. My last foray, I mentioned this morning that I was getting a Ancestry DNA kit, and it arrived today. I did it, and I've already mailed it back.
Oh, wow.
And it's like 6 weeks or so. And the reason I did this is because I have this block in my research on my great grandfather's father. So he comes into the picture in about 1854, and he marries my great-great-grandmother, and her name was Martha Jane Connor. And 1855, she gives birth to 2 children. One dies immediately, and the other one becomes Samuel James Kennedy, when we showed his death certificate earlier. But then he disappears. I mean, he is literally off the charts. And this gets me, I hate black holes, and I'll do anything to try and figure them out. But if I go on to Ancestry and I look at records, there's a lot of people that take what I call the easy way out. And they find someone with a similar name and they slot them in, and they say, this person is the one that married Mary Jane Connor. And then he moved to St. Louis. Well, to move from Montague County in, west central Missouri in 1855 and go to St. Louis, that's not something you did on a whim. So you either were running away or, you had a specific reason for doing it. And unfortunately, Kennedy is not that uncommon of a name. There are plenty of William Kennedys. There are Andrew Kennedy's. That was his name on the marriage license. And there are even some that just went, 20 miles away from where they lived and got married and had other families. So I don't know if this guy just got tired of being there and he went off and got married again, or if he actually was killed. That's always a possibility. 1855, you had a lot of, pre-Civil War stuff going on in the center of Missouri. And so you never know, bushwhacking and that type of stuff. But the interesting thing is if you look at the 1854 record that was recorded in the courthouse, is his name was spelled Canida. So it wasn't even Kennedy. And you don't see that until you come to the census in 1860. And by that time, he's gone and she's moved back home with her father, Alan Connor. And they are raised there. And then you see that Samuel has the last name of Kennedy. And so that's where it's been. But I've always wondered, where it is. But you really got to, you take all this information and it's nice to see it, but you got to give it the what we used to call in the Navy a float check. If it doesn't float, that means, it's going down and it's just of no value to you whatsoever. And you have to sort of use those kind of criteria on some of this information. So this is the other. Today, when I was looking for Olaus Bink's son, I came across other things that were posted to the same individual. So under his name, I found this news article. And this is from Moline, Illinois. Now, I actually found the original guy, the actual guy from 1811 to 1874.
Right.
He belonged to the Swedish American Church, evangelical Swedish American Church. And it was Lutheran, evangelical Lutheran Church, I should say. So here's this article, and it talks about the guy, and it gives the name, but it says it's Klaus, Claus, and it's attached to this other guy's name. And I looked at it, and then I started reading the article, and this guy helped found the Methodist Church in Moline, Illinois. And so he invited the people in and, got it, but it didn't match what you know about Sweden, because there are a lot of Lutherans in Sweden. So it made sense that the record that I found, and it's, I want to say it was like the University of Chicago Library or something like that, where this evangelical Lutheran register was. But it actually had the guy's dope date. So when you were born and then you're christened, that's called the Barnadope. And so it actually had his date. He was born and everything. And it said the little town that Patty gave me that he was born in. Mm-hmm. And it's west of Oscarvärn, which is on the east coast of Sweden. And then he actually traveled completely across Sweden to get on the boat to come to the United States, which is an interesting thing also. And the other thing was, I found a type note, and this one was written by a relative, later on in life, and he writes about the guy, but it gives his birth date is 1829, and 1829 is not 1811, but it says that he married a woman named Inga Charlotta Jonsdotter. And so you look at that, but that means you've got red flags popping up. Mm-hmm. And so all of a sudden, you need to go back to your records and then take a peek and see how many of these things actually hold water. I mean, it just, there may be too many holes in it to even begin to be true. But you can look, when you do these research, I came across a name of a guy that says he has a lot of photos of this guy, but they're being held privately. So you have to write him an email and say, would you please, send it? And most people are very, very forthcoming and helpful, and they'll send you these pictures and everything. And then I found another woman who lives in Alaska, and she had actually gone to the headstone over in Sweden and actually took a rubbing, and then she translated it. And so that picture is posted online also. So these are all things, but you've got all these little bits and pieces of information, and you've got to try and bring them together into a solid story and a family history, if you will.
So basically, as you're going through and you're trying to piece it together, you just have to, like you said, watch for red flags, make sure that things make sense, that you've got the right person.
Yeah.
So as you're going through,
I mean, otherwise you end up, it can be a very nice story, and it can become it'll become a family legend. You're related to so and so who came on the Mayflower, and and he was a great general, during such and such a war. But I mean, it's all family, a myth. It really becomes a myth, and there's a lot of people who have myths in their family. They'll tell you about them. So. But anyway, that's all I have.
But that's great. I mean, that was a lot of information, but it helps, because when you're trying to start out and you're not sure where to go and what to do, it's nice to have someone that's done it before you that can give tips. And
yeah, well, anything. I'll put this out there. If people here, I mean, I've done a lot of research, and I've been to conferences and things like that, and I've collected a lot of presentations that could support anything that I've put out today. So if somebody asks you a specific question, they want to know about census data, I probably got something that I can send you, and we can go from there.
Okay, so. That sounds great. Yeah, and I've had a lot of people say thank you. Very interesting. Enjoyed listening. Jeanne logged in a little late, so
yeah.
Michelle, thank you. She said I've been able to listen off and on and appreciate the information. So so thank you for doing.
You are most welcome, and look forward to talking to you in the future.
Very good. Yeah, and send me the websites, and I will put those on so people can see what those are too.
I'll have it to you momentarily.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.